Hello everyone, I hope you're having a wonderful day. Today, we're going to dive into the next chapter of Jack and Tu Tien's journey. After the devastating accident, their days in the hospital, and the painful return home where grief and shadows still linger. It's a story of heartbreak, resilience, and the fragile hope of rebuilding a life while unseen dangers wait in the dark. If you find this story meaningful, don't forget to hit the subscribe button so you won't miss the next video. The hospital room was soaked in silence, every corner heavy with the weight of grief. White light spilled down from the ceiling, washing over Tu Tien's pale face. She lay still against the sheets, her skin fragile, her breath faint, her eyes staring somewhere far away, as though searching for what had been lost. Beside her, Jack sat hunched, his shoulders trembling beneath the quiet strain of exhaustion. His eyes were rimmed red, the veins stark against the whites. His hand gripped hers tightly, as if letting go for even a moment might cause her to slip away forever. The door opened softly, and Jack's mother stepped inside. She carried a bowl of porridge, steam curling up and vanishing into the sterile air. Her voice quivered as she set the bowl down gently on the table. "You must eat," she said, forcing calm into her tone, though her eyes betrayed her worry. "You must stay strong." Tu Tien tried to smile, tried to ease the heaviness she could see etched on their faces, but it was faint, fleeting, a smile stripped of warmth. Her eyes remained hollow, like a part of her soul had been carved out and taken away. Jack's chest tightened at the sight. The guilt pressed against him like a weight too great to carry. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice rough, torn at the edges. His head dropped, his grip on her hand tightening. "I couldn't protect you. I couldn't protect our child." Tu Tien shook her head weakly. Though tears streamed down her cheeks, she reached for him, her touch tender despite her own shattered heart. Her thumb brushed across his hand in a slow, comforting stroke. "It's not your fault," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm enough to hold him together. "Don't carry this alone." But Jack could feel it all the same. The loss gnawed at him, a wound that no words could mend. He lifted her hand to his forehead, holding it there, as though her touch alone might absolve him of his failures. The door opened again, and a police officer stepped into the room. His tone was low, respectful, but his words carried a weight that sliced through the fragile calm. "The accident shows signs of intent," he said carefully. "We're investigating." The air seemed to thicken. Jack's fists clenched at once, his knuckles white, anger sparking beneath the grief. His heart thundered, his breath shallow. Intent. Someone had meant for this to happen. Someone had aimed to shatter their lives. Tu Tien's lips parted, her hollow gaze shifting toward the officer, then back to Jack. The question burned in both their eyes. Who had targeted them, and why? Jack's mother stepped forward, wrapping her arms around Tu Tien's fragile frame, whispering into her hair, "It will pass. You must keep going." Her embrace was warm, steady, but the weight of those words felt too heavy to bear. The room settled into silence again, broken only by the steady beep of hospital machines. Each sound was a cruel reminder of a merciless world, of lives fractured in ways no one could repair. The light filtering through the window painted them in a fragile glow, as though hope itself struggled to seep into the room. Jack leaned forward, resting his forehead against Tu Tien's hand once more, his mother's arm around both of them. They huddled together, three souls bound by loss and love, trying to find shelter against the storm of grief that threatened to consume them. Outside the hospital, a figure slipped quietly into the night. He moved with the ease of someone who did not wish to be seen, fading into the shadows of the street. His presence left behind an invisible chill, an unease that seemed to seep back into the room they had just left. Inside, Jack raised his eyes and saw Tu Tien staring blankly toward the window. Her face, etched with pain, carried a question she could not yet give voice to. She looked as though she were reaching into the void for answers that would not come. Jack's chest ached at the sight of her, but he kept his hand locked around hers, promising himself silently that he would not let her drift too far away. The hours bled into one another. Night gave way to the faint gray of morning. Light filtered in, soft and pale, through the thin hospital curtains. Tu Tien sat up slowly on the bed, her back propped against pillows. Her face was still drawn, her eyes still marked with sorrow, but there was a shift, a glimmer of focus returning, a gaze not entirely lost. The doctor came in quietly, his voice gentle, as though speaking too loudly might break something fragile. "You're stable now," he said with a small nod. "You can go home today." Jack's hand immediately found hers, his thumb brushing across her skin. He tried to offer a smile, faint though it was, but his eyes betrayed the grief that still lingered, heavy and raw. He helped her gather her things, his movements slow, cautious, as if the very air might fracture her further. When they left the hospital together, their steps were careful, hesitant. Each pace forward felt weighted, as though they feared the world outside might shatter them again. Jack's mother followed close behind, carrying a small bag of belongings, her face worn with quiet worry. At home, she busied herself in the kitchen, cooking, moving about with deliberate care. She set a meal before them, the aroma of warm broth filling the air. Her movements carried the weight of love, of someone who longed desperately to restore warmth to a house now haunted by sorrow. Tu Tien sat quietly at the table, her eyes drifting toward the yard outside. There, the trees they had planted together swayed gently in the breeze. She watched them with a gaze that was distant, yet resilient, as if the fragile branches reminded her that life, no matter how battered, still found ways to grow. Jack, meanwhile, returned to his work in the days that followed. His office filled with contracts and responsibilities, his pen scratching across paper, his mind pressing forward. But every time his eyes landed on Tu Tien, every time her face flickered across his thoughts, the guilt came crashing back. One evening, as the sun sank low, he came to her side. His voice was low, steady, but filled with a desperate promise. "I'll care for you," he whispered. "I won't let you hurt again. Not ever." Tu Tien nodded, forcing a small smile. Her hands trembled as she reached for him, her fingers brushing the watch on his wrist. A simple watch that had once been a gift, a symbol of lighter times. The joy it once carried was gone now, but her touch lingered there as though she might summon it back. Jack's mother appeared quietly behind her, wrapping her arms gently around her shoulders. "You must live on," she said softly. "Not just for him, for yourself." Tu Tien closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, her chest rising and falling in slow rhythm. When she opened them again, a spark flickered there, faint, fragile, but real. A tiny flame struggling to ignite against the storm that had nearly extinguished it. The days after leaving the hospital unfolded like fragile glass, each moment delicate and easily broken. Jack and Tu Tien tried to slip back into the rhythm of life, but grief hung over them like a shadow that refused to leave. The house was quiet, filled with the kind of silence that weighed on the chest. Jack's mother moved through the rooms with quiet determination, cooking, cleaning, bringing warmth where she could. She carried strength in her small gestures, laying out bowls of soup, folding blankets, softly humming songs from long ago. It was her way of holding the family together, though she too carried sorrow in her tired eyes. Tu Tien sat often by the window, gazing out into the yard where the trees they had planted swayed gently in the wind. Those trees were young, fragile, but reaching upward all the same. She traced their outlines with her eyes, her expression distant but steady, as though searching for resilience in their branches. The world had taken so much from her, yet something within her refused to give in completely. Jack returned to work, though his heart wasn't in it. Contracts slid across his desk, signatures scrawled onto paper, meetings filled with the dull murmur of voices. Outwardly he carried on, but inside, every glance at Tu Tien, every memory of her lying pale and broken in that hospital bed, brought the guilt crashing back. He told himself that by working harder, by providing more, he could make up for what had been lost. Yet, late at night, when the house was quiet, he sat awake, staring at his hands, knowing no contract, no deal, could ever erase the image of her tears. One evening, he returned home to find her in the kitchen with his mother. They were seated together, quietly preparing vegetables. Tu Tien's hands trembled as she cut, her movements unsteady, but she forced herself to continue. Jack walked over and touched her shoulder gently. She looked up at him, her eyes tired but soft, and he felt the ache in his chest swell once again. "I'll care for you," he whispered, leaning close so only she could hear. "I won't let you be hurt again, not by anyone, not by anything." Her lips trembled into a faint smile, though her eyes glistened. She reached out and touched the watch on his wrist, the one she had given him years ago. Her fingers lingered there, trembling slightly, as though holding on to a memory of joy. That watch, once a simple gift, had become a relic of a time before grief, before shadows crept into their lives. His mother reached across the table, her hand resting warmly on Tu Tien's. Her voice was low, filled with quiet strength. "You must live on," she said gently. "Not just for him, for yourself." The words settled between them, heavy but true. Tu Tien lowered her eyes, tears spilling quietly down her cheeks. She inhaled slowly, deeply, and when she looked up again, there was something different in her gaze. Not the hollow emptiness of the hospital, not the broken despair of that first night, but the faint flicker of something else. Resolve, fragile yet unmistakable. Days passed, and small pieces of life returned. Meals were shared, the house filled with the aroma of warm food. At times there were even faint ripples of laughter, brief and fleeting, but real enough to remind them that they were still alive, still capable of more than sorrow. Yet, beneath it all, the shadow remained. One afternoon, Jack stepped outside to the edge of their land. The farm stretched before him, wide and unfinished, the shell of a house standing tall but incomplete. He stood there for a long while, staring at it, his hands buried in his pockets, his jaw tight. The walls were half-built, beams exposed to the sky. To anyone else, it looked like just another construction project, paused and waiting. But to Jack, it was a promise. This house was meant to be their future. He saw every room in his mind, the kitchen filled with Tu Tien's laughter, the nursery that would now remain empty, the living room where his mother would rest in her rocking chair, smiling at them. The unfinished beams seemed to call to him, demanding not only completion, but protection. He clenched his fists, his gaze steely with determination. He would finish what they had started, and he would make it strong. This land, this home, would not be taken from them. Not again. Later that evening, he and Tu Tien sat outside together. The sky burned red with sunset, streaks of gold and crimson spilling across the horizon. The air was cool, carrying the scent of earth and grass. They sat side by side in silence, their hands clasped tightly between them. The warmth of their bond lingered, steady and real, even as the grief between them remained. But as the sun sank lower, a chill crept in. A shadow passed across the field, faint but unsettling. Neither of them spoke of it, but both felt it, the sense that something unseen lingered, watching, waiting. Tu Tien leaned her head against Jack's shoulder, her eyes closing, her breath slow and steady. Jack turned his face slightly toward her, brushing his lips against her hair, his eyes never leaving the horizon. Their peace was fragile, teetering at the edge. Yet, in that fragile space, there was love, and there was hope. Small, flickering, but alive. The night deepened, and the first stars appeared above them. They remained together, holding on, refusing to let grief swallow them whole. The world had already stolen too much. Whatever came next, they would face it side by side. But somewhere beyond the fields, unseen in the darkness, a figure moved, watching, waiting. The whisper of wind carried across the land, almost like a voice, faint and elusive. It curled around them like a reminder that peace was never permanent, that their struggle was not yet over. Inside the house, Jack's mother set another meal on the table, her face calm, but her eyes glancing often toward the windows, as though she too sensed the unease that lingered in the air. Back outside, Jack's grip on Tu Tien's hand tightened. She stirred slightly, her eyes opening again, catching his gaze. In her eyes was that spark again, a tiny flame refusing to die. They sat there until the last light faded, until the horizon surrendered to night. Their hands remained locked together, warm against the gathering chill, a quiet vow passing between them without words. The question still hovered in the silence, unspoken but heavy. Could they rebuild their lives amidst unseen threats? Could their fragile love withstand the shadows pressing in? The night gave no answers, only the distant sound of wind, carrying with it the faintest whisper of resilience. After the tragedy at the fair, Jack and Tu Tien face the heavy silence of the hospital. Jack's mother tries to comfort them with warm food and gentle words, but guilt and sorrow linger. Jack blames himself for failing to protect their child, while Tu Tien, though shattered, still finds the strength to console him. When a police officer reveals the accident shows signs of intent, fear and anger ignite. Someone wanted them hurt. Released from the hospital, they return home, where small routines and memories of love bring fragile hope. Jack's mother urges Tu Tien to live on for herself, and a faint spark returns to her eyes. Yet shadows follow them, unfinished dreams, an ominous presence, and the chilling sense of being watched. Together, Jack and Tu Tien cling to love, but their peace is fragile, teetering on the edge of unseen threats.